Welcome, everybody. Welcome back to our topic. And today's topic is women and time in particular. We welcome Dr. Anna Urowitz Freudenstein. And Anna, we look forward to your talk again today. Always something new, always something interesting. And we'll do it the same way as we have in the past. If you have any questions, just put them in the chat and we'll stop. Anna, you stop whenever at a good spot and we'll ask some questions and we'll go from there. So take it away, Anna.
Thank you very much, Carol, and everybody else. I am so happy to be with you here today after a kind of extended Pesach break. And actually just going to remind you now once, and then I guess I'm going to try to remind you again, but it'll be in the emails and everything, that next week we're going to start a half an hour later. I have another meeting to go to, so we're going to start at 2 next week instead of 1:30. Okay. So, remember we wanted to learn about Talmud, and that's why we're here all together. So we're here learning about Talmud, and then within Talmud, I picked this topic of time because I thought it would be able to address different aspects of Talmud. The Talmud is this multi-volumed, huge piece of literature known primarily as a legal text, but there are plenty of non-legal parts of it as well. And quite frankly, if you've had any exposure whatsoever unless you're going to yeshiva, but like in shul or whatever else, exposure that you've had to the Talmud is probably the non-legal parts, the stories, the ideas, a little bit of philosophy, and things like that in there. And I thought the nature of time would allow for that, and it has, to talk about those kind of bigger non-legalistic ideas. Remember, we talked about the creation of time, for instance. But of course, within Judaism, that many of these things have legal implications as well. So the discussion of the creation of time also led into the discussion of the calendar, and the calendar has huge implications from a legal perspective in Judaism. Today, we are going to get a little bit more legalistic. Actually, and I know you said you wanted my slide up, but for my intro, I'm starting to stop sharing the slide for a minute so I can see more people's faces, the ones that have their cameras on. Okay, we'll go back to the slide in a few minutes because I really feel like this one needs an introduction, a reminder of what we're here for. So we're here to get a taste of Talmud. Talmud definitely includes Jewish law. Okay, so Jewish law, though, as you well know, has evolved over time and has changed, regardless of what, some of our brothers and sisters in the ultra-Orthodox world who claim that, exactly what they do today is exactly what Moses said on Mount Sinai. I think we all have a realization, as did our classical rabbis throughout the generations, have a recognition that, in fact, Judaism has changed. So I would say that one of the prime examples of where Jewish law and even approach to law has changed has been the concept of women. And that is, of course, something that I think is therefore terribly important. As you know, last year we studied historical Jewish women the whole time. It's kind of my thing. I enjoyed doing it. But I think it's so important for us to understand where certain concepts of women, about women and legalities concerning women have come from in Judaism. Even if you're going to say to me, oh, I'm 100% egalitarian. And by the way, I know that's not true for all of you because that's part of the reason, in religion at least, that's part of the reason why Rabbi Cutler reached out to me in the first place last year to start talking about and getting comfortable with and excited about the notion of women in Judaism. But even if you were 100% egalitarian, let's say, and maybe you are, I think it's important for us not to forget where we've come from. Even if egalitarianism, Judaism, started in, let's say, really, if you want to trace it all the way back, maybe the 1960s and 1970s, as you well know, that is not a long time ago. And we have a whole wealth of Jewish literature and tradition and law that goes back so much farther than that. And as traditional Jews, which you all are, and I mean, defining traditional in many, many ways, but as traditional Jews, as you all are, you don't want to start from scratch. You want to take from the past, or understand from the past at least, what is worthwhile, what is relevant, what is important in order to help move Judaism forward into the future. I'm saying that because I know I'm speaking to a conservative synagogue, but I would say the same thing to a more liberal, modern Orthodox group as well. Okay. So because of that, that's why I picked the topic of women and time. Because the concept of, once we're talking about time, which is what our theme was, the concept of categorizing women's involvement in Judaism over the years has been absolutely dependent on time. Now, I could have gone one of two ways with this, and I really debated. It probably is enough for two classes. Well, it's enough for a whole course on its own. But one way I could have gone was go with the three classic commandments attributed to women from very ancient times, namely of candle lighting on Shabbat, taking challah on Shabbat, and the laws of nida, or family purity, regarding menstruation. Now, all of those things you could argue, with the exception maybe of challah, all are related to time as well. So I could have gone in that direction. Instead, what I've decided to do is to talk about categories of law, and this is where we're getting way more legalistic than we have before, and that's why I'm giving you this intro now. Don't worry, my slides are coming up in a minute, so everything will be categorized and color-coded in order to help you. But we are going way more legalistic than we ever have before, because I think that we're going to argue, and we'll see by the end, that categorizing women, or anyone, but in this case, we're talking about women, related to issues of time, and therefore seeing them as perhaps as second-class citizens, is something that is potentially influential on Jewish thought, again, up until recent times, and in some communities, even until today. So I think that that is important for us to understand, and I hope interesting as well. Okay, so that was my mindset. I always like to try to explain a little bit where I'm coming from. That was my thought process. Again, legal in nature, but kind of hopefully chunked up into approachable sound bites, as you'll see on the screen and things like that, to make relatively complex ideas as straightforward as possible. Okay? So don't forget to ask your questions. I guess because the nature of our group, the size of it, you have to put them in in the comments, but please feel free to write them down. All right. And here we go with the share screen. Okay, women and time. Make this box smaller. Lovely. All right. Before we even start to talk about women, we have to make sure we have a common vocabulary, that we're all talking about the same thing, because some of these words are used in different ways depending on the context. And here I want to make sure that we're establishing a common vocabulary. So first of all, today we're going to be talking a lot about commandments, about mitzvot. Okay, mitzvah, singular, mitzvot, plural. A mitzvah, as is used in common everyday language, well, everyday Jewish language, is sometimes called good deed. Like, oh, do me a mitzvah, or you did a nice mitzvah, whatever. Yes, certain commandments are good deeds, but not all commandments are. Okay, it doesn't mean it's a bad deed, but it doesn't mean it's necessarily a good deed. So, for instance, observing Shabbat is a mitzvah. It's not a good deed. It's just we do it, because God told us to have a day of rest. Okay, so again, many people might know this, but here's a reminder. When we're using the word mitzvah or commandment here, we're talking about commandments of the laws of God on the Jewish people. Now, if many of you know, there are 613 mitzvot traditionally believed to be in the Bible. They aren't listed that way in the Bible. It took until the Middle Ages, actually, for rabbis to come up with that number. And even so, there are different rabbis that number them off differently. Well, they all have 613, but they all don't say number one is number one or number two is number two. They the lists are different. But let's say there are 613. 613 is a huge number for the human brain to try to conceptualize. So there are many ways of making subdivisions of those mitzvot categories, subcategories, in order to discuss them, think about them. One way of categorizing them, and there are others, is between positive and negative mitzvot. We have to talk about positive and negative. It doesn't mean good and bad here. We'll see what it is. So of this number 613, you can do the math. 365 are positive and 248 are negative. Do not worry, you do not need to memorize this for the test. All right, so what do I mean by positive and negative commandments? Again, this has to do with a language issue, how we're used to seeing the word positive and negative. We're used to seeing that one is good and one is bad, right? One's a plus sign and one's a negative sign. In this case, when we're talking about mitzvot, we're talking about how the wording of the commandment is. So a positive mitzvah are the ones that are here in the green. Sorry. What I have on the screen for you here is just the 10 commandments, right? There's 613 altogether. But I thought just as an example, I would bring the 10 commandments because the 10 commandments are something that everybody is familiar with. And the 10 commandments has good examples of which commands are positive and which are negative. Okay, everyone knows all the 10 commandments are good. We're not talking about if they're good or not. We're talking about if they are formulated in a positive or negative way. So it's basically whether something needs to be done or believed, or something that needs to be not done or believed in order to fulfill the mitzvah. So these, I didn't give you obviously written out the whole commandments here, just the first few words. And so you'll see, for instance, the first one is always tricky to understand. Anochi, I'm the Lord your God. A lot of different philosophical questions about that, so we're just going to skip it for today. Let's go down to the two examples that are in green at the bottom here, at the bottom left. Respect the Sabbath day. So that's Shamor at Yom HaShabbat. And then honor your parents. Okay, so those two are thou shalt. Thou shalt respect the Sabbath day. Thou shalt honor your parents. So they are phrased as as positive mitzvot. Now, the Sabbath is a little bit tricky because it has double. It is respect the Sabbath day, but it's also thou shalt not work. So it has both a positive and a negative commandment, at least two, associated with it. Something as standard as lo tirtzach, thou shalt not commit murder, is a thou shalt not. Okay? It is a very positive thing not to commit murder, but it is considered a negative commandment because of the formulation of the language. For the Hebrew speakers in the crowd, the negative formulation is called a lo ta'aseh, or a love, and the positive one is called a ta'aseh. Lo ta'aseh and a ta'aseh. Okay? But you don't have, that's only for the Hebrew speakers. All right, so this is a difficult thing. It's not difficult, but it's a little bit tricky because we're establishing a vocabulary here so we can understand what's going on. So just as the reminder, the positive commandments, when I use the word positive, I don't mean it's good. I mean it's a thou shalt, and a negative commandment means a thou shalt not. All right, why are we talking about this today? We have to get to the topic of women and time. We have now established our some categories. What is a mitzvah? What is a positive mitzvah? What is a negative mitzvah? And now we have to take those categories, at least the positive mitzvot, and subdivide it even further into approximately 2 different categories. So in order to do this, we're going to go to the Mishnah, which we all know now hopefully is the foundation, the building bones of the Talmud, the older layer of the Talmud. And there is a Hebrew phrase up on the top as a title. Do not worry about it yet. I will get to it in a minute. But we are studying here from the tractate called Kiddushin, chapter 1, paragraph 7. I have it in 2 different slides here, so I wrote part 1, and the next slide is part 2. Here we go. All positive. You see, we learned that word already. Thou shalt. Time-bound mitzvot. Here's a new phrase we have not yet seen. Time-bound mitzvot. Oh, no, sorry. Time-bound mitzvot. There's a little star at the bottom of it. I suppose I should have made it red also. If we look at the bottoms, it says must be performed at specific times. Okay, so this is where we're getting to our main concept of time, or we're introducing the main concept of time. There are certain mitzvot that must happen at certain times, and men are obligated to perform them, and women are exempt. Okay, this is a major statement. It doesn't appear in the Bible, but it appears in like the earliest stratum of Jewish law post-biblically.
Okay, so right away there's 3 prohibitions here at the bottom. So as I said, as I was saying, we had the positive commandments, and then we had the specifically subcategory within that of time-bound. Those are the ones that women are exempt from. But just so you should know that women still have lots and lots of commandments attached to them, including the positive ones that are not time-bound, like I said, honoring your parents, honoring the Shabbat, and also all the negative ones. So all the thou shalt nots, men and women are equally obligated, except for 3 that are listed here in the Mishnah. 2 of them that have to do with barbering, and the 3rd one at the bottom, do not contract ritual of impurity from a corpse. It's really unusual why that's even here, because it's really only true for priests anyway. But I guess it's pointing out that it's for male priests. All right, summary. Next slide, please. Okay, because this is the important categorization that I want us to understand. Okay, the thou shalt, positive, that are time-bound, women are exempt. And basically everything else, men and women are equally obligated. Now, we saw on the previous slide that there are some exceptions for the thou shalt nots. As it turns out, there's exceptions even in ancient times for the thou shalls also. Next slide, please, the one with the little pictures on it. So of the exceptions, there are 4 major famous ones. There are others as well, but the 4 major famous ones are under a certain category called in Aramaic, Pirsume Nisa, the ones that we do in order to publicize certain miracles. And as you'll see, these all have to do with certain holidays where women were benefited, from the miracles as much as men did. And so it is appropriate for them to glorify God, and by fulfilling the commandments, to publicize these divine miracles as well. In the interest of time, I won't go through them, but hopefully you see on your screen what they are, and I put little pictures beside them as well. All right, so next slide, please. Exceptions and rules. Okay, so once we started talking about exceptions, even the Gemara itself, even the Talmud itself, which appears a few hundred years later than the Mishnah that we saw, starts addressing this issue. Like, what the heck are you talking about here? We're supposed to be talking about rules. Rules are rules. How come you start talking about exceptions right away? How are we supposed to deal with this if we're trying to understand how to observe Judaism and what Judaism's expectations are on women? So it has a little bit of a discussion here where other exceptions are brought up, some that we are talked about and some that we haven't yet. So here in the Babylonian Talmud of Tractate Kiddushin, it says, and is it really a rule that all time-bound commandments, positive time-bound commandments, women are exempt from? Behold, here's some examples. Excuse me. Where maybe it doesn't hold. Matzah, like I said before. You must eat matzah. This one actually is for the positive command at the Seder night. Not even to not eat chametz is true for all of Passover, but to eat matzah on the Seder is a positive command that is time bound to the timing of the Seder. And in fact, women are obligated in that. Then there's, for instance, rejoicing on a festival, all festivals, in particular, for instance, Sukkot, where it is a particular commandment to be happy, to rejoice. Women are equally obligated in that, even though it's limited to Sukkot. Hakel happens once every 7 years at the end of the sabbatical year, where all the people gather together at the temple to hear the Torah being read. It's equally obligated for men and women. So right here, the Talmud says, what do you mean you're telling me a category? There's exceptions. And now it's going to give exceptions of the other ones, the ones that you said before that are positive and not time-bound, that supposedly all women have to do, got exceptions here too. And the first one here, of course, is one we talked about before at the beginning of this session together and a little bit last year when we talked about women in the Talmud, that according to most or many rabbis in ancient times, that the very important mitzvah of learning Torah, which is a positive command and not time-bound, was not equally obligated on women. Similarly, the commandment to be fruitful and multiply, traditionally believed to be only on men, and redeeming the firstborn, another one related to the birth of the firstborn child. So all of those are actually positive and not time-bound commandments, which means that women should be obligated, but exceptions, they're exempt. So what's going on here? Why are we even talking about rules if there are so many exceptions? Even in the Talmud itself, in this red thing at the bottom of the screen I have here, is that part of the continuation of the discussion. I just put it in red because I really wanted you to notice it. Rabbi Yochanan said, we do not learn practical application of law from general rules, even in a place where exceptions are stated. So even in our case, you might have, where there's a list of exceptions, don't think that's all of them, because there are more also. So it's a very interesting phenomenon of, even though there's rules and categorization, that there's also exceptions built into the system. And the exceptions aren't things that we choose to do. The exceptions are told to us. So I have here just a summary slide. Then we saw this already, but hopefully you have a better understanding of it now. Thou shalls are ones that are time bound. Women are exempt. All other thou shalls and all thou shall nots, men and women are equally obligated, except for, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't tell you to change the screen, did you? It says nevertheless, these categories.
Change it again.
Hopefully, change it. Where it says nevertheless, do you have that one on?
Yes.
Yep.
I'm sorry, I'm getting used to this system. We're all learning on the ground together. Okay, so this was the summary screen that I wanted us to see, because I know these are complex ideas, but I really want us to think about them, because even though we, as I said before, are exceptions, and even the Talmud itself recognizes their exceptions, what I wrote there on the box on the top of the screen, nevertheless, these categories are often referenced. Okay, so even though there's exceptions, there is this notion in traditional Judaism that there are rules there are laws, commandments from God from which women are exempt, and all of those have to do with ones that are limited in time. And as we'll see soon, in a minute, there's a really an interesting and somewhat disturbing, I think, for modern people, idea here, perhaps, behind all of this, in terms of freedom of time that men have, perhaps, versus less freedom regarding time and maybe other things that women held in society, and therefore led to expectations. All right, my lights just came back on, but I think we're going to stick with this. So please change the slide one more time, and then I'm going to take questions. I don't know how we're going to do that, but as you'll see on the next slide in big letters, it says, is exemption a good thing or a bad thing? And what does that say about equality? Please turn to one more slide. If women are not equally obligated in important commandments, are they actually equal?
No, and they never have.
All right. So that's the idea that I wanted to get there to, that is related to the idea of time. We have, and women, we have more to talk about because I'm raising some questions for. I mean, I've established some categories and now raising some questions, and I think it would be terribly unfair to not at least try to give you some answers. Now, you might not like all the answers, at least I'm going to try to get some to you. All right. Any questions? How do you want to handle this? Carol or Randy, do you have any
Sure.
questions?
Yeah, there is a question. Joel and Sophie Schaefer from you raised a question. Why don't you ask the question?
Will I hear it? Try.
Oh, I don't know. If you unmute, okay, I can
No,
add it.
well, I don't know how this works. So
Okay, I'll ask the question. Is lighting Shabbat candles not a time-bound mitzvah? Women are obligated to carry out this mitzvah.
Right. So the Shabbat is complicated. As we saw on the screen that had the picture of the Ten Commandments, where I tried to introduce this idea about positive and negative, that Shabbat has many mitzvot attached to it, and some are positive and some are negative. So remembering and keeping the Sabbath day, and then thou shalt not do work, and the intricacies involved actually with all of that. So part of those intricacies involve candlelighting. So candlelighting, I think, well, there's lots of explanations for it, but I think kind of fulfills two major roles for Shabbat. One, in that it enables you not to do work by, setting up work of lighting the fire before Shabbat starts. And then it also brings an enhancement to Shabbat, because the idea of, even in a time when candles were the only form of electricity, light, which by the way is pretty hilarious for me to talk about, considering we just had a power failure, but that the idea of special candle lighting made out of special materials and things like that, I think was a special enhancement in the way of respecting Shabbat. So I'm going to leave it with that. The whole discussion here, by the way, is, a little bit wading into a territory that I'm not as comfortable with, namely of practical, law. As you know, I'm not a rabbi, and as I know, you guys do have a rabbi, amazing rabbi, Rabbi Cutler, and so I'm not into the exact, legal instructions about day-to-day Jewish life, but hopefully I've been able to point out to you there some of the intricacies involved in the wonderful mitzvah of candlelighting that you just asked about.
Okay, that's the only
Any other
question
questions?
that's the only
Okay.
one that's there. And you said that we were very lucky. We have Rabbi Cutler. We actually are even luckier because we have two rabbis. We have Rabbi Cutler and Rabbi Seed. So.
Oh, I'm sorry. You're right.
No, that's
Yes,
okay.
Rabbi
I just
Seed.
wanted to throw that in. That's okay.
Thank you. Yeah,
so,
no, this is Rabbi
Anna,
Cutler. The one that
Let's go
reached
on
out to me.
and see if there's questions this next part.
Okay, wonderful. So really what we're getting now is we've established a legal category, and I would argue that the legal category has informed the approach to women as a whole. Because let's not forget, we're talking about, in ancient times, modern, pre-modern times, when you're talking about people's lives were completely not subsumed, but involved with religion. Like, it wasn't like there's no church-state separation. There's no, church-body separation. Everything they did was all that our foremothers and our forefathers did. Everything was related to the concept of Jewish law. So if there's a specific category of Jewish law that's terribly important and that women are exempt from, then it potentially affects the way one thinks about those women. Now, you might think of those women, all women, excuse me. You might think, oh, great, exempt, woohoo, we can have a party. We don't have to do it. Okay, I guess there's some. But if you think about it, if it's something important and you're exempt from it, and even in some categories are actually forbidden from doing it, according to some commentaries, some rabbis, then what does that say about how men and women are perceived in terms of are they equal or not when it comes to religion? And again, we're talking about generations upon generations that religion equals life, right? There's no like, oh, I feel different because I have to do something differently on Shabbat when I'm in shul. No, this would be, impactful on every moment of every day. So that's the kind of thing that I was hoping to kind of bring to the forefront. All right, so let's talk a little bit. Please turn to the next slide that has the colored chart on it with the yellow. Because as always, I need to talk a little bit about history, okay, historical context. So I just wanted to remind everyone that what we're talking about here, you'll see there's a white arrow in the lower left-hand corner. We're talking the time period of the Mishnah. This particular categorization about the exemption of women from this important category of law is stated for us formally, initially in the beginnings of the classical rabbinic period, probably around the year 200 CE, actually a little bit before that. But there's a good chance that it existed orally before that. It is not written in the actual written Torah or Tanakh. Okay, so I brought this chart just to remind us of kind of the flow of Jewish history and particularly the books and other ways that these traditions would be recorded. Okay, the next slide is our link to our Jewish timeline. We're going to skip that for today. It was just another way of seeing the time. So let's go ahead to the next slide, please, which is our dictionary definition from Merriam-Webster dictionary. Are people there? If you're not there, tell me. Skip that. Skip timeline and go to the patriarchy.
Okay.
Okay, wonderful. So dictionary definition of the patriarchy. You're welcome to look at the whole thing on your own. In the interest of time, please look where the red line is, the red arrow, excuse me, where it says control by men of a disproportionately large share of power. So when we talk about the importance of law in Judaism and who can perform certain rituals, who must and who is exempt from it, we are really talking about if men can do it and women can't. It could be seen as an example of the patriarchy that would affect, therefore, how women are seen. If they can't do everything, then are they seen as lesser than the people who can do everything? Or perhaps, as we'll see, and I'm sorry, I'm not a great actress. I can see and hear in my voice, probably I'm not as convinced by this argument. Does this mean that women are better than men and that's why they're exempt because they don't need these laws? All right, let's see how that works out. Next slide, please. Just have a picture here of a little chicken and egg, because really when we talk about the patriarchy and ancient law and divine law, you might begin to wonder, it's a bit of a chicken and egg question. Which came first? Was it the society that existed in this way and therefore the law flowed from it? Or was the law given by God and therefore the society grew up around it in the same way, in this patriarchal structure? I will leave that to you and your relationship with God and Judaism to see where you stand on that question. All right, next slide, please. This is really part 2. I've established categories having to do with women in time for you. I have talked about the exceptions about women in time, which unfortunately probably confused you even more because it is a confusing idea. And then once I introduced the exceptions, I went back to the generalization, which all our major Jewish thinkers always have, and try to think about what that could mean in terms of women and Judaism. If women are expected to do less, then what takeaway are we meant to have from that? And in fact, we have a number of Jewish philosophers over the years who have addressed this issue, and they all come back to nature of time and control of time, control another issue related to patriarchal structures. And so that really brings us back to our theme about women and time as well. So that's why I wanted to end with these, but also introduce them to you so that you could understand, even though I've presented a challenge, it doesn't mean I came up with the idea of the challenge. Obviously, this challenge concerning the nature of women and their responsibilities has been voiced by others. And as I said, different answers have been given. Some, depending on your personality and your approach to God and religion, you might like one more than the other, or you might not like any of them, or you might like all of them. Let's see. Next slide, please. The first one is the more philosophical approach that has to do with the nature of women. This one's by Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch in 19th century Germany. Very influential rabbi in the origins of modern Orthodoxy. So in his commentary to the Torah, to the book of Leviticus, there's a verse there that talks about sitting in the sukkah on Sukkot. So that's a time-bound positive commandment, and that therefore women are exempt from doing it according to halakha. So I guess it's at that time that he decided to address our issue. And I've bolded it for us and read some of the key parts here. The Torah did not impose these mitzvot, again, not just sitting in sukkah, but all positive time-bound commandments, because it does not consider them necessary to be demanded from women. Okay, there's an assumption here that these are harder to do. Not harder, but less convenient. It's a lot easier to sit in your warm, heated home and serve the food in there than to schlep out to the backyard and sit in the sukkah, or to make sure that there's enough room for everybody in the sukkah and everything else to build a sukkah. So he's saying that some of the things didn't need to be demanded by women, and for women, going to continue reading, all time-bound mitzvot, according to him, are actually symbolic procedures to bring certain facts, principles, ideas, and resolutions afresh to our minds from time to time, to fortify us to realize them to keep them, to realize them and to keep them. So again, the example that I gave before of tefillin is really to remind us of God. And so that the putting on the tefillin is a positive time-bound commandment. Women are not obligated to do it, and that men do it to help them remember God and their obligations to God. I'm going to continue reading. God's Torah takes it for granted that our women have greater fervor and are more faithful enthusiasm for serving God than men, and that. So here he's talking about the nature of women. According to Hirsch and others, women are more inherently spiritual, and they don't need the artificial trappings of certain of these mitzvot to make them religious, and so therefore they are exempt from them. So in this case, I believe that he thought he was actually glorifying women and saying that they were better than men in this regard. Little interesting twist at the bottom, and that they are in less danger than men from the temptations which occur in the course of business and professional life. So reflecting on some kind of an ideal here in Germany in this time period, the women living more secluded lives, it's easier for them in the home, easier for them to keep their spiritual sensibilities intact without the need of certain mitzvot to remind them. Okay, so that's his approach to having to do with women's nature. Okay, we didn't talk so much about time there. The next ones are more related to time. Please turn the slide to where it says women's time is not her own, part 1. Okay, at the top it says Sefer Abu Draham, who was Abu Draham was a rabbi in Spain in the 14th century. And there, warning to the modern people in the room, the reason that women were exempted from positive time-bound commandments is because the woman is subservient to her husband to perform his needs. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm just going to summarize. Basically, there's a limited number of minutes in a day, and her husband needs him to do stuff for him. And God, if there were a time-bound positive commandment, would need her to do stuff for God or for her relationship with God. There would be a time and energy conflict there. And so the Torah is not going to bother to make the women have these commands in order to her to free up her time for her husband. Then I'm just reading at the bottom. Therefore, the Creator exempted her from his commandments in order that she have peace with her husband, that she can do stuff for him and he won't get mad at her for taking up so much time putting on tefillin, etc. Okay, next slide, please. I'm going quickly through these relatively difficult ideas. Moving to the modern period, 1984, although I would argue someone's not terribly modern, the former Lubavitcher Rebbe, that he, in speaking to the women and girls of Chabad in 1984, said as follows: women are freed from performing these mitzvot, as he calls them, which are obligatory only at a fixed time. For instance, we were talking about tefillin. It's true for talit as well in this case. He quotes an older mystical writer there, the Arizal, and he says, in the red, when the male performs the mitzvah, it is unnecessary that the woman should do them separately, for she's already been included with him at the time when he does the mitzvah. The husband takes care of it for the wife, or even for his daughters. Don't ask me what this means for single women. It is not discussed by the Rebbe here, but he assumes that when a man performs these mitzvot, he's performing them for his household, namely his wife and his daughters, and therefore they can be exempt from them. And then the red on the bottom, and then she can devote her time and energies to her unique mission, which one would assume was being a wife and the mother to their children. So the time top, it says woman's time is not her own, right? And she doesn't have to stress about it because according to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, it's taken care of by her husband. Next slide, please. One more, because again, I'm not a good actress, and I think you could hear from the tone of my voice that I'm not incredibly convinced by these arguments. If you are, more power to you, and I don't mean to disrespect your position. But I did want to make sure to have one that gives an appropriate nod to tradition, which I think is what we've been doing all along, always in our studies together, with also recognition that we live in modern times. And this is of a modern Orthodox rabbi of New York City called Rabbi Saul Berman. And he wrote a book maybe 20 or 30 years ago, or 30 years ago already, called The Status of Women in Halakhic Judaism. And there, he says, well, I hope we're on number 3 now. Women's time is not her own. Slide. While not demanding adherence to one particular role, it is nevertheless clear that since for most of our history, our continuation as a people depended upon the voluntary selection by women of the role of wife, mother, homemaker, the law would and did encourage the exercise of that role. Let's not forget, as hard as it is to be a wife, mother, homemaker in our day and age, in pre-modern times, pre-industrial times, the work was exhausting and never ending. So, that role is absolutely vital today for different reasons as well, but absolutely vital in different ways in ancient times. So, the idea is freeing up more of woman's time in order for her to do what she needs to do really did lead to ultimately the success and continuation of the family. And go on here talking about the nature of exemption. Exemption would be a tool used by the Torah, by the rabbis, to achieve a particular social goal, namely to assure that no legal obligation would interfere with the selection of Jewish women of a role which was centered almost exclusively in the home. You know, if Jewish women said, well, I got to put on tefillin and talit and go and learn in the Beit Midrash all day long in the yeshiva, well, there would be no more Judaism because somebody does need to take care of the house. So he's saying that that would be true in the past. However, yes, it is vital to emphasize that even with these exemptions, the wife, mother, homemaker role is not the mandated, necessary, or exclusively proper role for women in Judaism, even though it is clearly the preferred and protected role. So the idea is that it's preferred and protected, but you don't have to do it. So what he's saying here is that by freeing up time for women in order for her to devote her time to her family was a historical necessity, and it could be a choice in today's day and age, but he's trying to explain the nature of this exception, that these rules are exempt of women, rules that are very, very stereotypically Jewish, and that women have traditionally been exempted from and therefore left out of parts of Judaism that are very central, most would argue, to Judaism. And so that's why I wanted to introduce the idea to you today, to talk to you about it, to talk about the nature of time, how one spends one's time, how this affects law, obligations, expectations, and also perspectives on how we actually see different categories of people in Judaism, namely women. Any questions?
There are no questions written in the chat. Oh, wait, I just got one. This is from Arnie and Elaine Rose. In a co-parenting approach, couldn't women take on these time-bound obligations?
Right. So there is something that is happening now, and again, this is more within the realm of practical, halacha, but I will tell you anecdotally that I have heard about some people usually within liberal orthodoxy, that talk about something called a paradigm shift, which is basically, I think, what you're addressing, that in our day and age, when we realize that parents can co-parent, assuming, of course, there's good things in place in terms of, parental leave and, employers that respect it and all kinds of things like that, that within a paradigm shift that we are privileged to be living in, that we can take advantage of in our world today, does that mean that there's a chance that the definition of woman as a category that would be exempt from positive time-bound commandments, that is not necessarily always associated with the mother in the family, but maybe it should be assigned to the prime caregiver at that time, and then within that paradigm shift, that could shift back and forth between parents depending on parental leave and other things going on in life. And within that paradigm shift, then that would enable for instance, of course, I'm only talking about heterosexual relationships here, that homosexual marriage or union would be a whole different situation. But in this case, I'm talking about a heteronormative situation, that in that case, within this paradigm shift, that sometimes the father would be the woman, namely exempt from positive time-bound commandments, and sometimes the mother would be, depending on what proactive role they're taking with the children at the time. So I have heard this anecdotally from one or two rabbis in Israel as an idea. In Israel, actually, I haven't heard about it so much in the States or in Canada, but it's an idea that is kind of being experimented with or thought about in very small circles that are very, very concerned with halacha, as well as very, very concerned with ensuring that women are seen as equal as possible within Judaism.
Anna,
So I don't know. I don't know how often that is true of. I've heard of it. I don't know how prevalent it is.
The explanation that I was always given was in terms of the obligation for the women is more like the one, the third one you gave, where the women's main role or important obligation is are the children, and that is such a high level of importance that they had to be free to be able to do that and not be bound by time. So forth. I don't know if that was sort of a cop out, but that was,
I don't think it's a cop out. It's a legitimate explanation. The problem with that explanation is it does, I think it's a little bit more meaningful in a day and age when everyone got married and everyone got married younger. Mm-hmm. It's a little bit harder to swallow for women and or for men who, as the marriage rates are down and the age of marriage is higher than it used to be. So, and of course, there are many people that choose never to get married or not choose, they just don't, and people who are, divorced and widowed and things like that, or people that don't have children, people that choose not to have children, or people that can't have children. So if we think about all those different people, which clearly exist in our Jewish communities, then the example that you were given, which is totally one of the legitimate examples out there, unfortunately, it's a little bit deaf to all of those people's, realities. So that's why, personally, it doesn't jive as much as with me. Although I have to admit, once I became a mother myself, and especially when I had small children with breastfeeding, etc., was the first time I really truly understood that explanation from a personal level. And I could get it, but unfortunately, if we're talking about generalities and rules and things, as we often do in law, it doesn't cover enough for me in terms of, it doesn't see the reality, doesn't validate the realities of all of those other Jews as well, not just, moms of young children.
Are there
Again, that's just my personal opinion on it.
There are no other questions in the chat at the moment. Does anybody else have a question before we end? Anna, this must be an interesting discussion when you teach this at chat with the sort of the youth of today, I bet.
Yes, it is an interesting discussion. And like I said, I threw in the normativity in the end. And of course, that it needs to be addressed at a much higher level also, especially with really potential, definitions of families and parents and things being kind of different than was realized by the rabbis of the Mishnah.
We do have one last question. What about the daily blessing, thanking God for not being made a woman?
Oh my gosh.
You knew that one had to come up at some point.
Yeah, at some point. I'm going to say I'm not touching it. Ask Rabbi Cutler. You know, of course, that the prayer is changed in the conservative movement. Yes. And does not have to do with the topic of time. So I'm going to leave that one aside. Not that it's not a good question.
Okay. Next week's topic is time and the Jewish holidays. And speaking of time, we're changing the time for next week till 2:00. So I know our Anna will send out a message reminding people, but don't forget to come on at 2:00 next week for time and the Jewish holidays. And then we do have one more after that, the one that we had missed, which will be on May 18th, day or night, the magic of dusk. So everybody have a good week. Anna, thank you again. Interesting stuff.
Thank you.
That you raise, and everybody have a good week, and we'll see you next week.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for having patience with my internet connection.
It
and
happens.
the power in my house. Okay, thanks everybody.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.